Hello, school leaders and educators. Welcome back to another MTSS micropedie. I am really glad you're here, and I am super excited for today's episode, talking about how long a student should stay with a particular tier. And I'm really passionate about this topic because I get this question a lot. How many data points should I collect? What am I looking for? When do I know that I should move this student to another tier? And honestly, you will almost never hear me say things like on a tier or in a tier. And the reason for that is because if we think about the connotation of a preposition, right, a prepositional phrase, we know that things like on and in are positions, right? So they are places. If something is on something, it is placed on top. If something is inside, it's placed inside. And I really encourage folks, educators, schools, to get away from this idea that tiers are places, um, and really start to focus on tiers as intensities. And so you might hear me say, stay with a particular tier intensity or stay at a particular tier intensity. Because even though those are still, considered prepositional phrases, they have a little less of a placement connotation and a little bit more of an active application to the intensity of a particular tier. And so I'm really excited to get into that topic. And we're going to cover a couple other things, such as, collecting data points and when to know when it's time to shift to a different intensity, whether you're going up in intensity or down in intensity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some monitoring, tracking systems, and we're going to talk about how effective the intervention is and what it is that we're looking for. And so stick around till the end of the video because you are not going to want to miss the content that is about to unfold. So welcome. Again, my name is Andrea, and I am the owner and creator of MTSS by Design, MTSSbydesign.com. And I help school leaders with problem solving their multi-tiered systems of support from the ground up. And so my work focuses on strategies and tools that will help schools to make decisions and improve upon and scale up their MTSS efforts by organizing and re-envisioning the resources that they already have in front of them. And it's one of my favorite topics to talk about. So let's dive in. So let's talk a little bit about the tools that we use to help us make the decisions that we need to make when trying to determine how long a student stays with a particular tier. And so the first up that we are going to talk about is the creation of data collection tools to use in data-based decision making. And as we know, as educators, how we collect our data and how we look at our data to make decisions is going to play a big part in how well a student responds to the intensity of a particular tier. And that conversation starts at analyzing our data in tier 1. So things like NWEA data, iReady data. I've seen schools that use Scantron data. And I know what you're thinking probably right about now. You're thinking, of course, we start looking at our data in tier 1. We collect our NWEA data, or we collect our iReady data, and we sit down as a team and we look at it and we look to see who is struggling. That's a start. But when we think about that phrase, and this whole video really looks at how we're using language to make decisions about our MTSS. And so forgive me if this seems a little bit like a grammar lesson on top of an MTSS design lesson. But stick with me. I promise if you stick with me, it will make sense as we continue to go through. So when we sit down with our data, our NWEA data or our iReady data, and we say, who is struggling? Well, when we say that, we are actually having a tier 3 discussion. Maybe a tier 2 discussion in some cases if we start to look for trends in different areas where multiple students are struggling. But ultimately speaking, when we sit down to have a tier 1 conversation, we want to make sure that we are looking at tier 1 as a whole. What do we know about tier 1? Well, tier 1 is the universal instruction. It's the universal setting. It's the setting where 100% of our students get access to quality, rigorous, evidence-based curriculum. And so the decisions that we make have to be based on how well that quality, evidence-based curriculum is working. And so it's important for us to ask questions like, how is this curriculum working for the second graders? How is this curriculum working for my class? How is this curriculum working for Mr. Jones's class? Fifth grade, sixth grade, kindergarten class, you get the idea. And so making those decisions about how well the curriculum and instruction are working at that tier sets up how impactful we can be with intervention at more intense tiers 2 and tiers 3. And so when thinking about creation of data collection tools, it's important that we don't skip the steps of going through the process of analyzing the tier 1 data and asking some questions about tier 1 data that can allow us to always have a pulse on the health of the tier 1 as a whole. We can't make decisions about tier 3 or even tier 2 without having a really good understanding of the health of our tier 1. So when we're looking at creating data collection tools for this purpose, we want to make sure that we have opportunities for the data to show how a whole class is doing, how a whole grade is doing. Why isn't this working for everyone? How well is this working for everyone? And what do I need to do as the educator to make sure that everybody in my class as a whole are progressing towards the skills and the outcomes that I want them to achieve? And so to help you with that discussion, I've created a tool that will walk you through a few of the steps that I think that we need to start taking, at least during the review of universal screener data. So whether it's fall, winter, and spring, this is a tool that you can use to really get a good pulse on how well your tier 1 is working and quantify it. So often we think, oh, my tier 1 is fine. Yeah, it's about 80%. Well, this is another one of those phrases that as someone that has studied, multi-tiered systems of support for students for as long as I have, this is another phrase that really, really gets me to ask a lot of questions and probe a lot of insight from whoever it is that I'm speaking to. Because when you say my tier 1 is about 80%, what are we saying about? Are we talking that about 80% of our population participates in tier 1? Or is it that about 80% of our population are meeting or exceeding benchmark at the point of assessment? So at the fall, at the winter, and the spring. And so that's actually a topic that we're going to cover in a future micro PD. There's actually a podcast called MTSS by Design. Makes sense, right? Titled, What If We Got RTI Wrong? And you can access that podcast basically anywhere that you get podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, you get the idea. Google Podcasts. And if you were to listen to that video, you would get an explanation about how I feel about the RTI triangle, and really asking this question of, what if we actually got RTI wrong? And let me know if you decide to listen to that podcast, because you should drop it in the comments below and let me know what you thought about some of the topics that I cover in that podcast. I'd be really interested in knowing what your thoughts are. So you can either comment on the podcast itself or you can come back to this video and comment here. But I'd really like to know what your thoughts are about that topic. And I guess now is a good time to say, hey, if you're getting value from this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell because you're not going to want to miss the MicroPD topics as they come out each week. So subscribe. And also, if you like this video, it does help others to find the video when they are searching for resources pertaining to RTI and MTSS. Okay, so back to the topic at hand about how long students should stay with a particular tier intensity. And so now that we've talked a little bit about some of the data collection tools, that's going to lead us into the topic of monitoring student progress. And this is going to lead us down to that decision or to that topic of how long we should stay with a particular intervention while we are monitoring student progress. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that that decision is going to be different whether we're talking about a tier 1 intervention, a tier 2 intervention, or a tier 3 intervention. So often I will have schools call me and they want to talk about how many data points should they collect. Is it 6 data points, 8 data points? Do students stay in intervention for 10 weeks, 12 weeks, making those decisions on students? And I'm going to say that if you are going through the process of collecting data and monitoring student progress using data, those answers of how long a student should stay in intervention is going to depend on what the data is telling us. So we can't forget that what makes a good intervention, right? And so we have to really make sure that we are ascertaining between the difference between something that is just a strategy that we're using or a strategy that is also an intervention. And if you haven't watched my previous video of that's not an RTI intervention, you may want to go ahead and click. This is the newbie thing again. I'm not sure which direction the card goes. You're going to want to click on that video to get a better understanding on what I think makes a good intervention. And then that video will help you to make better student monitoring decisions because it allows you to have the skills to ask the questions of an intervention that help you to decide whether that intervention should continue or whether we should stop that intervention and move on to something else. Primarily because, and I do talk about this in that other video, that an intervention is a strategy, but a strategy is not always an intervention. And that an intervention, a strategy that qualifies as an intervention and is being used as an intervention should have an immediate impact on students if we are applying it at the correct intensity and it's matched appropriately to the foundational skill that is missing for that particular student. So it's really important that we are able to look critically at what we're using as interventions, because if we're getting into 6, 7, 8 weeks in intervention for a particular student and we're seeing a flat line, there are so many other questions that we have to ask about why that's a flat line. Is it matched properly? Is the intervention quality enough for this particular student and that student's needs? And really looking at, oh my gosh, what we're doing is actually not an intervention. We're using a strategy, but we're not getting what we're looking for. And so we have to be careful when we're monitoring student progress that we are actually monitoring their progress against actual intervention and not some other strategy that we are using as an intervention. So go ahead and click that card so you can get some of my thoughts on how I ascertain the difference between a strategy and an intervention. Okay, so moving right along, the next thing that we really need to think about when we're trying to determine how long a student stays with a particular tier intensity is looking at intervention as a process that we're doing and intervention as a strategy that we are using. Okay. And so this is something that I happen to see a lot as well. So we choose an intervention, no matter, depending on what it is. And we say, okay, so this student is going to receive this intervention and, we're going to give it, 10 weeks to see if it's going to work. In most cases, if you're waiting for 10 weeks to see if an intervention is going to work, you've waited too long. That when you're monitoring that student's progress, there should be a response to that intervention, to that strategy that you're using within 2 to 3 data points. And if you're not seeing that, then it's time to stop, right? But then thinking about stopping, then it leads us down again to these other questions, like that student may stay in intervention at a particular tier intensity for 10 or 12 weeks, but they may not receive intervention for the same amount of time, right? Because we're talking about two different things here. If we talk about students that are in intervention because we are trying to interrupt or stop their lack of progress with a particular, grade level content, then fine. It may take 10 or 12 weeks or longer for that student to not only catch up to where their peers are, but be ready to progress with their peers when they are no longer in intervention. Then we're also talking about intervention as in the programming that we're using, the strategies that we're using, the thing that we are doing, the intervention that we are doing while they are in intervention. I feel like I'm not explaining this well enough, but you're thinking, you're really thinking about how to be in intervention can last a long time, can be 10 or 20, 12 weeks. And then that we may apply a variety of intervention strategies inside that time frame. And what we're looking for is an immediate impact. So you would never stay with a single intervention for 8 weeks unless that student is significantly closing their gap with their peers. Now, when we're talking about closing the gap with their peers, we also have to be thinking about where their peers will be when that student is no longer receiving intervention, right? And so we have to think about, not only are we having to close the gap that might have been created for one reason or another, but we also have to be able to bridge that student from the gap closure to where their peers are when they are no longer receiving intervention. And so we have to be careful that we are not putting a student in intervention or into an intervention timeline and then sticking with a single intervention for the length of that timeline, because they're actually two different things. And that gets us down into a topic of decision rules and how we determine decision rules. And that's probably a conversation you've had at RTI meetings or MTSS meetings. And I do want to cover that topic, but we're not going to get into it today. So you all want to be looking for that as well as I break down the process of determining decision rules and when to halt the process of what you're doing or the strategy that you're using in order to get the maximum benefit out of the time that a student is in intervention. And I don't mean 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes of intervention. I mean the length of time that a particular intervention should last or could last for a student when they are responding to the interventions that we're using during that time frame. Okay, so how long should a student stay in a particular tier intensity? If we're talking about tier 1 intervention at a tier 1 intensity, students will typically stay in that intervention for the duration of a we'll call them trimesters. Even if you're on quarters, we'll call them trimesters, because we're talking about like that fall screening to the winter screening, and then the winter. Two things happens. One, they meet the goal that it has been set for them, and in this case the goal is 100%, right? If we land at 80, that's fine, but if we're at 100, that's always where we want to go, and that's a whole other video topic. But the point being that if the group gets to the goal based on our decision rules, then we can stop intervention. If students are making progress where we can project that they will meet their goal by the next screener, then we can think about whether we want to intensify that intervention or if we want to pull back a little bit on that intervention. So tier one interventions can last, but should be monitored. Every so often, probably every other week, or at the maximum every third week, and that intervention length will likely last for roughly 12-ish weeks, or 15-ish weeks, depending on how long the time is between your fall screener, winter screener, or winter screener, spring screener. In terms of tier two intervention, this is actually another really interesting concept for me, because oftentimes I hear schools and educators talk about, this is my tier one, and then this is tiers two and three, right? And so we kind of inadvertently group two and three together. And I would like to challenge the world to be thinking more of tier one and two being grouped together, and then tier three actually being at higher intensity, a tier that tends to get an additional level of questions or an additional level of hypothesis and probing about, what it is that has led to a student to receive that intensity of intervention. And so oftentimes when we're doing a whole group intervention, we are actually doing a tier two intervention depending on how many students are meeting or exceeding benchmark in whatever, domain it is that we're actually looking for. So tier two interventions can also last 10, 12, 15 weeks, depending on the length of the time, right, between those two screeners. And those should be monitored at least every other week, right? Because we want to make sure that the intervention is working for the group. And tier one and two interventions tend to happen simultaneously. They tend to happen in the regular classroom with the support of staff and other educators. We really look at the allocation of resources and apply them as heavily as possible to that universal setting for tier one and tier two interventions. Now, in terms of tier three, how long should a student stay in tier three? Well, that again is going to depend on how quickly they respond to the intervention, and not forgetting that to ask those other questions that I talked about earlier if a student is not responding to that intervention. So when a student is not responding, we have to ask and answer honestly whether the intervention is being conducted with fidelity, whether it's being conducted the way that we have designed it to be, whether it actually matches the need of the student, and all of those kinds of other questions. And so tier three intervention can also last that 12, 15, or 10, 12, or 15 weeks, but clearly should be monitored at the minimum weekly. But honestly, you want to be collecting those data points daily about how to monitor their progress. And to do that, we have to be breaking down the things that we're looking for into small units so that we can track them easily, because we're looking for that immediate effect. So if our trend line after 5 or 6 data points, and we've taken data on tier 3 intervention, say every other day for for a short period of time, if within 5 data points we're not going to be able to predict like the trajectory of their goal setting and whether they're going to be where their peers are at the end of intervention, then you're going to want to stop what you're doing and assess that intervention, make sure it fits the quality of intervention. The other thing to consider is that depending on your population, depending on your socioeconomic status of your school, depending on the number of English language learners that you have, special education students that you have, the number of educators that you have, and their longevity with education, whether they're brand new or whether they've been around for a while, all of those things are actually going to make and determine how long your tiers should last or will last. And sometimes in very low socioeconomic areas, students may stay in tier 2 or tier 3 intervention for a very long time. And if a student is staying in a tier intensity for a really long time, right? So we'll say through the entire second grade, this is not an indicator that there's a learning disability or that we should be looking to do additional testing if, again, this comes down to decision rules, if that student's trajectory shows that they are making progress towards where their peers will be at the time that they exit intervention. If their trajectory is not on that course and you have tried multiple interventions that you know meet the criteria of a quality intervention, then we can start looking at some additional diagnostics for that student. But if a student is making progress at a particular tier intensity, and we are able to reasonably project their growth um, compared to where we would want them to be at the exit of the intervention, they can stay in a particular tier intensity pretty much indefinitely. If a student needs tier 3 intervention to make progress towards the same end as their peers for the entire second grade year, and then when they exit at the end of the year, they are on par with their peers, then there is no, I mean, that's fine. That's absolutely 100% okay. We can also anticipate that that same student is likely to need that level of intensity as we head into third grade. And if that same student needs tier 3 intensity for the entire third grade year, understanding that we've set decision rules in place and that the trajectory of that student's progress is on par with their peers, that student can receive tier 3 intervention, tier 3 intensity for the duration of third grade. There is no there's really no hard and fast rule to know when to stop a particular tier intensity or to progress to a higher tier intensity. That's like 6 data points, 8 data points, 10 data points. We're not looking at that at all. What we're looking at is the trajectory of that student, the intensity of the tier that they're receiving, and whether that intensity is actually not only filling in holes that may have been created, but that are giving them the opportunity to be on par with their peers on the other side. And that as long as that student continues to move towards that, they can receive a particular tier as long as they need it, whether that's first day of kindergarten through the end of fifth grade, or whether it's the third week of second grade to the eighth week of second grade. And then they need it again in the spring, and then they need it again in the fall of third grade. It doesn't matter. What is really important is understanding how the tier 1 health is, and making our decisions on student progress in tiers 2 and 3, and making sure that they are on par with the health of the tier 1. If you have additional questions about this topic, because sometimes it gets a little bit crazy trying to identify all of the different nuances of the topic of tier length, tier intensity length, et cetera, et cetera. It can get a little bit, when you start talking about the different connotations of intervention and the different connotations of all of the different things that we've talked about today, it can get a little like jumbled up. So if you have additional questions, please drop them in the comments below. And on your way by, go ahead and click that subscribe button, because I do want to dive into some of these additional topics that have come up as topics, through this particular video. And again, don't forget that there is a video that talks about the framework that I use to determine when a particular strategy can be applied as an intervention. And so click on that card right there and you'll go straight to that video. And then some of the things we talked about today should make better sense once you have viewed that video. And so as we look forward to the future, we're going to cover topics like decision rules and whether we got RTI wrong. The podcast, don't forget the podcast, because the podcast is also going to help to frame some of the decisions that we're going to want to make in our MTSS design.